Source History host, Patience, a developer from Vietnam series history.exe, Episode 02, The Mongol Empire, a masterclass in horizontal scaling. I'm Patience, a developer from Vietnam, and this is Source History, where we don't just tell the past, we debug it. Last episode, we talked about a system that refused to scale, a monolith that routed everything through one node, a government that responded to bug reports with silence, and an empire that collapsed not because it was attacked, but because it was architected to fail. Today we go to the opposite extreme, a system that scaled so fast, so aggressively, that the rest of the world couldn't even read the logs before it was already at their doorstep. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, the most successful distributed system ever deployed on this planet. We talk about scaling to the moon in Silicon Valley. We put growth charts on pitch decks. We worship founders who 10x their user base in a quarter. But here's a number that puts all of it in perspective: 22%. That's the percentage of all land on Earth that one organization controlled at its peak. Roughly 24 million square kilometers, larger than the entire continent of North America. Home to over 100 million people, built in under 60 years, no cloud infrastructure, no venture capital, no pitch deck, no running water, no fixed address. Just a founder with an extremely aggressive go-to-market strategy in a system architecture that nobody saw coming. His name was Genghis Khan, and what he built was not just an empire, it was the greatest horizontal scaling operation in human history. Today we're going to debug it. Let's start with the baseline. Before Genghis Khan unified anything, the Mongol steppe was a fragmented cluster of disconnected local nodes. Dozens of tribes, no shared protocol, no unified API, no service mesh. Each tribe ran its own logic. Each tribe had its own memory. Leadership was inherited, not earned. Alliances were temporary. Betrayal was a feature, not a bug. In simpler terms, it's a legacy codebase, built by committee, over centuries. Nobody has documentation. Everyone is afraid to touch the core modules. What Genghis Khan did was not just conquer those tribes, he refactored them. The first thing he abolished was the tribal identity system. Under the old architecture, your position in society was determined by which family you were born into. He replaced it with a merit-based permission model. A soldier from an enemy tribe who fought with courage could become a general. A slave who demonstrated loyalty could become a trusted administrator. He deprecated bloodline-based access control and shipped role-based permissions instead. The result? The most motivated engineering team anyone had ever assembled. Now here's where the real engineering begins. Every distributed system has the same core problem: latency. The bigger your network, the harder it is to keep all nodes synchronized. Information degrades over distance. Commands arrive late. Decisions get made on stale data. This is not a modern problem. Every empire in history struggled with it. The Romans built roads. The Chinese built canals. The Mongols built the Yam. The Yam was a physical relay network that stretched across the entire empire. Every 25 to 30 miles, a station. Each station stocked with fresh horses, food, shelter, and trained riders. Think of it as a CDN, a content delivery network. A CDN works by storing copies of data close to the people who need it, so requests don't have to travel all the way back to the origin server. The Yam did the same thing with horses. Instead of one rider making a 2,000-mile journey on one exhausted animal, the message was handed off at each station to a fresh rider on a fresh horse. Hot swapping resources. Zero downtime. No interruption to the data stream. Speed up to 200 kilometers per day. The Persian Empire at its peak could move a message across its territory in about 7 days. That was considered miraculous. The Yam made that look like dial-up. At peak operation, the network maintained over 50,000 horses across hundreds of relay stations. This was not a communication system. This was a nervous system, and it gave the Mongol Empire response times that no competitor could match. To access the Yam network, you needed credentials. The Mongols called it the Paiza, a physical tablet, gold, silver, or bronze, that granted the holder the right to commandeer any resource at any node in the network. Horses, food, shelter, labor, gold Paiza, admin-level privileges. Issued directly by the Khan. Silver Paiza, elevated user access for senior officials and military commanders. Bronze Paiza, standard access for messengers and local administrators. Role-based access control, carved in metal, 7 centuries before we wrote the specification. Marco Polo, who traveled the empire in the 1270s, described the Paiza system in detail. He was genuinely shocked by how efficiently it worked. A man carrying a gold tablet could walk into any village in the empire and demand the best horses, the best food, and immediate safe passage. If a node refused to honor the token, the system executed a kill command. No appeals process, no ticket to raise. Brutal? Yes. But it also meant the system never suffered from permission inconsistency. Every node honored the same credentials. Every time. Every distributed system needs a global configuration, a shared rule set that defines what every node must follow, regardless of where it's deployed. For the Mongol Empire, that was the Yasa. The Yasa was not a bloated legal code. It was a lean, strict configuration file. Core rules, clearly defined, harshly enforced. No looting before the battle is won. No killing of enemy soldiers who surrender. No harming of religious clergy. No disrupting of trade routes. But here is what made the Yasa genuinely remarkable. Not what it included, what it deliberately left out. It did not mandate a state religion. It did not require cultural assimilation. It did not try to rewrite the local operating system of every territory it absorbed. They separated concerns, core business logic, centralized, local culture, religion, language, left to the node. For those outside the terminal, think of it like a franchise model. McDonald's enforces the recipe and brand standards, but each location hires local staff, prints menus in the local language, and adapts to local preferences. The Mongol Empire ran on any operating system. Christian territories in Russia, Muslim territories in Persia, Buddhist territories in China, all compatible, no dependency conflicts. This is why the empire lasted as long as it did, not because it was powerful, because it was interoperable. Now let's talk about how they actually fought. Most armies of that era were monolithic, one massive force, centrally supplied, centrally commanded. If the supply line was cut, the army starved. If the command structure was disrupted, the army froze. Single points of failure. Everywhere. The Mongols ran microservices. Each unit, called a tumen, was 10,000 soldiers. But more importantly, each tumen was a self-contained, independently deployable container. In simpler terms, a container is a unit that carries everything it needs to run. It doesn't depend on the host system. It doesn't depend on other containers. It just runs. Mongol soldiers were the same. Every soldier carried his own food, dried meat pressed under the saddle, fermented mare's milk in leather flasks. A tumen could operate for weeks without waiting for resupply. The command structure was also distributed. Generals were trusted to make local decisions. They didn't need to send a request to headquarters and wait 6 months for a response. Sound familiar? It should. It's exactly how modern engineering teams are supposed to work. Faster decisions, better adaptation to local conditions, no cascading failure or when one unit takes a hit. Every system has a weakness. The Mongols knew theirs. They were nomads. They did not build walls. And because they had never built walls, they had no native expertise in breaking them. Against the fortified cities of the Jin dynasty or the ancient walled cities of Persia, raw cavalry was useless. You cannot charge a 40-foot stone wall. Most empires would treat this as a fatal flaw. The Mongols treated it as a missing dependency. So they imported the library, Persian engineers who specialized in siege machinery, Chinese specialists who had developed gunpowder weapons. Experts captured from every territory were not enslaved in the traditional sense. They were integrated, given resources, given purpose, deployed. When the Mongols arrived at the walls of Xiangyang, a city that had held out for 5 years, they showed up with massive counterweight trebuchets designed by Persian engineers, operated by a multinational technical team, commanded by Mongol generals. The city fell in days. Instead of spending years building in-house expertise, they identified the best available package and integrated it directly into their stack. No ego, no pride, just what does the system need to function? And their siege strategy itself was a distributed denial of service attack. Surround completely, cut all supply lines, send continuous pressure from every direction. Exhaust the defender's resources until the system can no longer respond. Cities didn't fall because the walls were broken. They fell because they ran out of memory. I want to stop here for a moment, because this part is personal. The Mongols reached Vietnam 3 times, 1258, 1285, 1288, 3 separate invasions. The most powerful, most optimized military system on Earth, against a small country on the edge of the continent that had already spent 1,000 years being invaded by larger neighbors and figuring out how to survive anyway. All 3 times the Mongols failed. And I don't think this is talked about enough. Not because it's a point of national pride, though it is, but because of what it reveals about the limits of the system. The Vietnamese commanders, particularly Tran Hung Dao, understood something the Mongols didn't expect. Don't fight a distributed system on its own terms. Don't try to outscale it. Make the environment hostile to scaling. Use the rivers. Use the jungle. Use the heat. Let the terrain act as a rate limiter. Force the system to slow down, to consume more resources per operation, to lose efficiency with every kilometer. Avoid decisive engagement. Wear down the supply chain. Strike when the system is at low resource. Guerrilla warfare is adaptive load balancing. The Battle of Bac Dang River in 1288 was essentially a memory overflow attack. Tran Hung Dao planted iron-tipped stakes underwater at low tide, waited for the Mongol fleet to advance at high tide. Then, when the tide went out, the entire fleet was impaled. The Mongols lost hundreds of ships. Their third invasion collapsed. It wasn't strength that stopped them. It was knowing exactly where the system would fail under the right conditions. Some vulnerabilities only show up in production, and sometimes the best way to defeat a system is to understand it better than it understands itself. Every system, no matter how well designed, has a failure mode. For the Mongol Empire, there were 3. First, memory leak. As the territory grew, the latency between edge nodes and central system became unmanageable. Information from the borders arrived slow, sometimes corrupted, sometimes fabricated by local administrators who had learned to tell the center what it wanted to hear. When your decisions are based on stale data, eventually you make a decision that crashes the process. Second, a catastrophic fork. When Genghis Khan died in 1259, the system had no clean succession protocol, no documented handover process, no defined ownership of the code base. The empire forked into 4 separate versions: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These forks were not compatible. They competed for the same shared resources. They had merged conflicts that turned into wars. Gradually, each branch diverged so far from the original that they stopped recognizing each other as the same system. Third, accumulated technical debt. Governing dozens of incompatible cultures, religions, languages, and economic systems required constant patches. Each patch introduced new complexity. Each compromise created a new edge case. At some point, the cost of maintaining the system exceeded the value it was generating. Not because the original architecture was flawed, but because scope had grown beyond what any single configuration file could handle. At some point, every system needs a rewrite. The Mongol Empire just never got one. So what does the Mongol Empire actually teach us? First, infrastructure is a force multiplier. The Yam Network didn't win a single battle, but it made every battle faster, better informed, and more coordinated. Build your communication infrastructure before you think you need it, because by the time you feel the pain, you're already behind. Second, don't bundle your ideology as a hard dependency. The Mongols thrived because they kept the core minimal and let the edges run their own logic. Every empire that tried to enforce one culture on everyone generated more resistance than it could suppress. Interoperability is not weakness. It is how you scale beyond your own limits. Third, even the best architecture has a succession problem. The Mongols built an extraordinary system, then forgot to document the deployment process. There was no README, no handover protocol, no defined owner when the founder stepped away. If you build something that depends entirely on one person to hold it together, you haven't built a system. You've built a single point of failure with a very impressive front end. Plan your deployment, write the documentation, or someone else will fork your repo, and they won't ask permission. Next episode, we debug a revolution that changed not just how empires are built, but how human beings spend their lives. The Industrial Revolution. For the first time in history, humans didn't just use tools. They became components in a system. Replaceable, schedulable, optimized for throughput. What happens when you scale production but forget to account for the welfare of the processes running the jobs? Spoiler, the processes push back. Hard. As a developer, I've learned that the most impressive systems aren't the ones that never fail. They're the ones that understand their limits. My name is Patience. This has been Source History, where the past is always in production and no system ships without consequences. See you in the next commit.